Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and this is going to be a training video where I went through a chest and triceps session. And in this session I did 4 sets of dips at 1 to 2 reps in reserve, 6 sets of incline cable flies at 0 to 1 reps in reserve, and also 6 sets of tricep pushdowns at 0 to 1 reps in reserve too. So we're starting off here with dips, and basically I like to use dips as another compound press basically. So it could be in place of something like a dumbbell press or a barbell press. And typically we think of dips as more of a tricep dominant movement, which I do think it is, but I also think that based on the technique we use, we can emphasize or de-emphasize certain muscle groups more than others. So the way I'm doing the dips, I'm intentionally trying to get a little bit more of a chest emphasis on these. Now, I don't think they're going to be really much of a chest dominant movement overall. They're probably going to be more of a tricep dominant movement, but I still like to maximize how much chest involvement I can have because I have some tricep isolation work in this session anyway. And I also have some chest isolation work in this session as well. So it doesn't matter too much. I'm still taking care of both muscle groups individually, but I like to look at these dips as more just as an overall compound chest exercise. An overall compound pressing exercise. So the way I'm doing it, trying to get some more chest involvement, is by sort of leaning forward more. And my mental cues to myself while doing these dips is basically I'm trying to lead with the chest, and I basically do a fairly controlled tempo on the way down. And when I feel an active stretch on my chest fibers, that's when sort of I know to reverse the movement and I've hit appropriate depth. So that's basically how I gauge my my technique, and based on, how much of a stretch I feel on my chest in the bottom position is how I adjust my sort of technique and make sure I'm really trying to actually involve those chest muscles as much as possible. And as we can see with these dips, I'm doing sort of an ascending loading pattern. So I started with the lighter weights, and each set I'm increasing the load. And the reason for this, as I've discussed in previous videos before, is I'm trying to do sort of a pre-fatigue method. And the reason for that is if I can sort of get away with using lighter weights and slightly higher rep ranges in the earlier sets, it means that I'm going to be more fatigued and therefore not going to be able to lift as much weight in subsequent sets. And the reason for this is that if I can get away with using lighter loads overall for my training sessions, then that's going to be less overall joint stress and lower systemic fatigue. So basically, if I can get the same hypertrophic stimulus by taking each set to the appropriate reps in reserve while inducing less fatigue, that's a positive for hypertrophy training in my opinion. So the rep ranges and loads, like is probably well established in the research, probably don't matter that much in the grand scheme of things, as long as we're taking each set close to failure or to the appropriate reps in reserve and making sure the muscle is the limiting factor, then it doesn't matter too much what rep ranges and loads we use. So now we're moving on from the dips to incline cable flies. And the reason I'm doing these with an incline as opposed to just flat cable flies is to try and hit the upper fibers of the chest a little bit more, because the dips are a little bit more probably lower chest dominant or mid chest dominant, if anything. So I want to try and hit those upper fibers a little bit. So with my chest isolation work, I'm doing it on an incline to hopefully get a little bit more involvement of those upper fibers. Now, I've got 6 sets of these flies. And as we will see going through these sets, I'm starting off with a lighter weight again and progressively increasing the load. And then eventually I reach sort of a peak load where my rep ranges drop too low, and then I reduce the load back down. So I don't really want to go below around 10 reps on these. And if I do, that's when sort of it's probably a good idea to drop the weight. And as we can see, I think on this set I got maybe 9 or 10 reps. And then the next set, I probably only got about 6 or 7 reps. And that's why I decided to drop the load and work more with some higher rep ranges after this. And the reason, again, for doing these sort of ascending loading range. For this movement, it's not so much a fatigue or joint stress issue. It's more just some variation from set to set. I think it's a little bit more enjoyable to, vary the load from set to set and do a little bit, I guess you could call like a pyramid type loading pattern. It's just a little bit more enjoyable, and it provides a little bit of variation from set to set, because if I have to do 6 sets and it's all exactly the same weight, then it can get a little bit boring. So basically just an enjoyment perspective and to provide some variation, I like to adjust the weights from set to set. And I also like starting off with a higher rep range on these isolation lifts as well. And that is because I feel like I get a nice pump for the first set, get some blood working, and it's a nice warm-up, so that subsequent sets I'm sort of in the groove and sort of ready to go. So that first set also almost acts as a bit of a warm-up set too. Now, I have my feet up doing these cable flies, and the reason for that is because I feel like if I have my feet down, I get a little bit more of an arch in the back and a little bit sort of more of that shoulder blade retraction. And ultimately, I can just probably lift a little bit more weight, and I'm probably cutting the range of motion a little bit shorter. When I have my feet up on the bench like this, I feel like it's a more strict movement, and I'm only using the chest and nothing else. And even though I probably can't lift as much weight or do as many reps with my feet up compared to if my feet were down and arching a bit more, I feel like the strictness and the tension is concentrated on the muscles I'm trying to train, which are the pecs. Also, having my feet up like this, I feel like it allows my shoulder blades to move a little bit more freely. So when I'm going down and coming back up, my shoulder blades can a little bit more freely retract and then protract on the way up. I feel like if there's an arch and sort of the shoulder blades are retracted, based on the anatomy of the pecs, we're probably not getting full contraction of them at the top, because the pecs basically, one of their attachment sites is on the scapula. So if we don't allow our scapula to sort of protract a little bit at the top of the lift, then we're probably not maximally recruiting the chest in that lift. So that's my reasons. I don't think it's much of a difference whether your feet are up or down. I'm just experimenting at the moment with trying to have my feet up, and it seems to feel good so far. I'm also making sure, not making sure, but my technique here, I have my elbows bent. And the reason for this isn't really like a typical how we would think of a fly, but the reason I have my elbows bent is in sort of almost more of a half press, half fly motion, is because if I sort of do that typical fly motion where the arms are more straight, I tend to feel a little bit of irritation and stress on the elbows especially, and a little bit on the shoulders too. So I like to have a bend in the elbows going down, and it doesn't really impact the involvement of the chest either, because the chest has nothing to do with the elbows. The chest attaches on the humerus, so it only crosses the shoulder joint. So as long as we're making sure that shoulder is going through a full range of motion, what happens at the elbow probably doesn't make as much of a difference, if any difference at all. This is the last set here. I've dropped the weight down, and I'm probably taking this last set pretty close to failure. With this particular setup and this machine, the tension curve is a lot, well, not a lot, but it's a little bit, the movement's a little bit harder at the top range compared to the bottom range. And that's why you can see in some of those sets, it looked fairly easy at the bottom at the start of the lift, and then at the top of the lift, the end range was a little bit harder to sort of lock it out. And lastly, we have our triceps pushdowns to finish off, so some isolated tricep work. We've got 6 sets here, and the setup here is basically the opposite to what I was doing. I'm basically doing drop sets for all of these 6 sets. So starting with 15 kilos here, and each set I'm just going to take one of the little 2.5 kilo plates off, and I'm only giving myself 20 to 30 seconds rest here between sets. So sometimes I like to do drop sets for these, sometimes I like to do straight sets, and sometimes I like to do ascending sets. But for this session, I decided to do go with the drop sets. I think they work well. And also because the rest periods are so short, it's quite difficult to do straight sets or ascending loads throughout each set because fatigue is so high each set. Again, I like to do any sort of metabolite techniques for arms, because I have noticed in the past, if my volume gets too high with arms, and I'm doing sort of typical straight sets with heavier loads, then my elbows do start to get irritated and I have to drop the volume. So basically, I don't think that short rest periods and these metabolite techniques are inherently more hypertrophic. If anything, they're probably slightly less hypertrophic per set, but the trade-off there and the positive is that we can get more sets done, so more volume done with less overall joint stress. So it's sort of a trade-off of quality versus quantity. And for this exercise, or for these sort of exercises, I think that it's a net positive to have shorter rest periods, use lighter loads, or by doing any sort of metabolite technique, in order to allow us to get more volume, even though the lifting performance is not going to be as good per set. So that's the reason for it. I don't think it's inherently the best way to train. That's just my personal opinion and how I'm training at the moment. I am always experimenting with different training approaches and finding what works best specifically for myself, and I think everyone should do the same thing. For some people, if they have not that much volume to do for their arms, or for any muscle group for that matter, then maybe it is better to do the typical straight sets, because that might allow more lifting performance. And with low volumes, you're probably not going to run into any joint issues. But for me, I have noticed in the past, I do need a lot of volume for my arms to see any growth. And yeah, if I do high volumes and with typical sets, typical straight sets, it's a little bit too stressful on my elbow joints and they start to develop some issues. In terms of technique, I'm specifically trying to make sure I don't let my elbows drift forward at all as I'm pushing the weight down. If that elbow drifts forward, we're basically switching off the long head of the triceps, and we're not going to have them maximally recruited in the movement. That's because of the anatomy of the long head of the triceps. It crosses both the elbow and the shoulder joint. So basically, if we let that elbow drift forward, that means the shoulder is going into flexion, which is the opposite movement of what the long head of the tricep performs. And as a result, it's not going to be maximally recruited and involved in the movement. So we've got to make sure we are, for tricep isolation movements, that the elbow stays in one position, or if anything, moves backwards.